Welcome back. In the last couple of days, various premiers across the country have held their State of the Provinces addresses outlining the priorities of their administration. Gauteng, the Eastern Cape, Northwest and KwaZulu-Natal premiers all addressed the challenges facing their respective provinces in the quest for service delivery. For an appraisal of these SOPAs, I'm now joined by Professor Dirk Kotze, a political analyst from the University of South Africa. Prof, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. Now, let's maybe perhaps begin here. If we take an overview of provinces in the country, and not based on our personal experiences as laymen in South Africa, but rather statistically, how do our provinces fare in comparison to the last 5 to 10 years? Are we in a better or worse off state?
Yeah, that's quite a difficult question to answer that because comparisons are very difficult to make. I think because some provinces are, for example, very much dominated by what happens at the local government level. And I think very much specifically about Gauteng, where the metros there is to a large extent the core of Gauteng, compared to the Northern Cape or other provinces like the Eastern Cape, which has large areas that are not so densely populated. So that relationship between the province and the local government is a very important one. And I think what we are seeing is that in most provinces, local authorities are struggling, especially with service delivery. And that applies very much to Gauteng. It applies to provinces like the Northwest and the Western Cape to a lesser extent. But that is to a great extent what is defining the performance of provinces. I think one of the key problems about provinces is that they have very few powers of their own in constitutional terms. Almost all their powers are what are referred to as concurrent powers. And that applies to, for example, policing, to education, to healthcare, to housing, and all of them. Therefore, it means they can't take decisions completely on their own, but they have to do it in conjunction with the national government also. And that, in a sense, I think is one of the key hindrances for some of the provinces not to be able to move quicker in terms of decision-making and implementation.
So, Prof, I mean, the provinces outlined some of their challenges. What key issues were most frequently addressed, do you believe, in these SOPAs? And how do they reflect the current socio-political landscape in our country?
Well, the issues that are most addressed are those of economic development. Provinces can make a very important contribution to that. Provinces like, for example, Gauteng and the Eastern Cape are very much rely on, for example, the automotive industry. The Eastern Cape very much, the emphasis of the Premier there was very much on that, in Gauteng also. And then it is about service delivery, about services. In Gauteng, for example, the number one of the 13 problems that Premier Lesotho identified is water provision. Electricity is at this stage in a better situation, although the so-called electricity restrictions that are placed on it still affects many of the provinces. Security is another one, which is a common important point, a common priority amongst all the provinces. And then, as I've said in the beginning, local government and local government services is also across the board one of the main priorities of all the provinces.
I mean, we've heard some of these, Prof, throughout the week. How do the concerns raised in these SOPAs differ from province to province? I mean, you've already mentioned that the Gauteng Premier highlighted the 13 problem areas, and also just one of those that he highlighted was the mushrooming of informal settlements being on the top of his list, and KZN also touching on how budget cuts impact medical shortages. Are premiers actually showing confidence in terms of their constituency in how they're addressing these challenges?
Well, again, as I've said in the beginning, the provinces are in the sense squeezed between the national and the local governments. So, for example, the provincial legislatures are not very active. There has been many questions in the past to what extent there is still a justification for provincial legislatures. The provincial executives are more active, is more seen and experienced by the public, but not necessarily the provincial legislatures. So what we are seeing therefore is that provincial governments are supposed to be able to deal with issues like, for example, drugs. That's a very important component. And then also another very important component is, as I said in the beginning, is that of economic development. Now, a province like the Northwest is, for example, the province with the highest unemployment rate in South Africa. And what we've seen in the State of the Province address there is that quite a lot of attention has been paid by the Premier to different forms of job creation, mainly by the public sector. And I think this is one of the complications. If we compare all these addresses, all these State of the Province addresses with the State of the Nation address by President Ramaphosa, then he placed more emphasis than the provinces on the public-private partnerships, and therefore the role of the private sector with respect to economic development or job creation by implication, therefore. So there are some differences in emphasis, but most of the issues at provincial level and local level, as I said in the beginning, are more or less the same. And in a province like Gauteng, they are almost impossible to distinguish between the two of them.
And I mean, just that disconnect, Prof, especially when it comes to the province of the Northwest, with the Premier stating that they're looking for the public to create job creation, and of course the criticism that they're getting there. How much more effective would it have been if government was to create a conducive environment for private sector to be able to flourish in order for those jobs to be created, for them to be able to overcome their unemployment issues?
Yes, I think one of the key components that's absent in terms of the relationship with provinces is the fact that local government or local authorities do or cannot play, I would argue, at the moment the role that they are supposed to play, and that is that they must create the local conditions for economic development. It's very difficult for the province to do it from the provincial level on their own if they don't have the agencies on the ground, and that is the local government. And the reason why the local government cannot do it is the fact that from a fiscal policy point of view, they don't receive enough money from the national fiscus. They receive only about 10%, while the province receives about 55, 56%, and the national government almost the same. So the allocation between the three spheres of government is skewed in favor of the first two and to the detriment of local government. And I think this is one of the reasons why provincial authorities or provincial governments struggle to really kickstart economic development on their own. I'm not talking about provinces like the Northwest and others where, for example, mining is very prominent, and a lot of the economic activities there, or the Northern Cape is another one where it is very much built around that, or the automotive industry in Gauteng and the Eastern Cape. But where the local authorities are supposed to create the conditions conducive for economic development and for, by implication, job creation, where that is absent, and that is in, I would say, almost the majority of the local authorities, that is very difficult for the provincial administration in that void almost that they have to function to really be successful.
So, Prof, how effective do you believe the SOPAs are in holding provincial governments to be accountable? And so that, are there any mechanisms in place to ensure that these promises that have been made are followed through?
I would say that the problems that's experienced about accountability at national level, and that is why there was already a change in the electoral system with the last election in May last year, also applies exactly in the same way to the provincial governments. I think because the provincial legislatures are less known, less visible, less in the face of the public, therefore there's even less accountability. The fact that they are much smaller than the National Parliament and National Assembly means that the portfolio committees that exist there are very much overloaded with work because they have so many different portfolios that they must look at. that they also don't play a very effective role in that respect. So I think in general, what I'm actually saying is that especially local, provincial legislatures, parliaments, for them there is actually a need, an urgent need to look at it in terms of reform in order to make them more prominent in the face of the public, more accessible to the public. And the problems, as I say, with regard to the electoral system applies even more to that of provincial legislatures. There is a process of reviewing the electoral system that's at the moment taking place with a parliamentary committee that has been established. But again, it does not receive enough attention in the public or for the public to really understand that this is where the real reform will have to take place.
Speaking of that public, Prof, I mean, to what extent do you think the public engagement is, especially when it comes to our SOPAs? How important is it for citizen feedback in shaping provincial policies and initiatives?
Well, it's absolutely important, and it should be regarded as such. But I think, as I've now said, people are still seen on TV, the broadcast about portfolio committee sessions where the ministers and the directors general must account for what they're doing. We don't see it when it comes to provinces. It's very much in the background. So I think that the public in general, in many instances, will possibly don't even know about the existence of these legislatures and the work that they are doing there. And the fact that there's also very little legislation that's been passed by the provincial legislatures. And that is why it goes back to the time of President Mbeki, where there was a white paper launched by the minister then, Sidney Mufamadi, on provinces that was asking whether these provinces, and especially the legislative side, was still playing the role that they were supposed to play.
All right, Prof, thank you so much for your time and for your inputs this evening. That's Professor Dirk Kotze, political scientist from the University of South Africa.